You're listening to a podcast from the Abbey Theatre's Oral History Project. For more information about the archive, visit abbeytheatre.ie. In this podcast, Thomas Kilroy, noted Irish playwright and member of the Abbey Theatre Board of Directors, recalls his earliest experience of theatre and discusses his writing career and influences.
The background contact with theatre for me was the world of the fit-ups and of touring companies, Anya McMaster being the obvious one, who came to Callan. And so we saw a lot of Shakespeare and restoration comedy through McMaster and people like him. There were at least 4 or 5 other companies that were on a regular basis touring, some of them English, and they were remarkable, really, wonderful kind of seat of the pants theatre, and sometimes quite powerful. I also had an immediate kind of contact with McMaster, in that we had a very good teacher of English, a man called Peter Birch, a priest in Cairns, who eventually became a quite radical bishop in his day. And he was far-sighted in all kinds of ways, not least of which in introducing us to kind of contemporary writing and stuff like that. Now, it was either he, I can't remember, but it was either he or another priest who brought McMaster into our Leaving Cert class. He must have been touring in Kilkenny. So this individual arrived with the dyed hair and the day makeup and the extravagant costume and sat on a chair in front of the class. And the only way I can describe it to you is that he took us through Hamlet. In a mixture of kind of commentary and acting parts, a doddery Polonius and a simpering Ophelia. It was wonderful, but he took us through the play in great detail, and it was my first contact with great acting, because I was sitting just a few yards away from him. And he had to control unruly schoolboys who found him funny, and he did control them. But that kind of experience of meeting theatre and the raw, as it were, had a huge effect upon me, I think. I have a memory, and I don't know whether it's accurate or not, that I was actually at a performance in the old building, up in the gallery, but I certainly was at several productions in the Queen's. One in particular which was quite striking, and that was the experience of watching Walter Mackin on the stage as an actor. It might be home as the hero, but he was wonderful, and he had the same quality as McMaster. In fact, I think quite influenced by that type of acting. Very large, overdressed, overdone in many respects, but theatre. And the fact that he was somebody that I knew a little bit about from Galway, that was interesting in itself. But I saw other productions as well, and I can't remember them with as much vividness as Walter Mackin.
Kilroy recalls writing his first plays and the process of getting them to the stage.
First thing I wrote first thing I finished really, it was a radio play called The Door, and at this point I was lecturing in UCD, but I had been writing The Door for some time, and it was based upon a story told by my father as a sergeant of the guards, that one of his duties was bringing mentally ill people into the asylum. And he came back on one occasion, I remember, from this tragic journey, and his thumb was totally without any blood. It was white. And the unfortunate man that he was bringing to hospital had held his thumb with such force that it kind of drained the blood out of it, and he had awful trouble getting the circulation back. And this stayed with me, and it was the basis of this play. And I entered the play in a competition for, I suppose, for first radio plays, for the BBC in the north of Ireland in Belfast, and I won it. And they gave me a wonderful production with Cyril Cusack, and Godfrey Quigley, and a couple of other very good actors. And so I actually met acting at a very high level at a very early stage, and it had the effect of making me ambitious for the future. And it went on, and it done a couple of times, translated into a number of languages. But it was just kind of working with Cyril and Godfrey, in rehearsal. And I stayed friends with them afterwards. But Godfrey was in, there was a company in Dublin called The Globe, run by Jim Fitzgerald and Godfrey, with Norman Rodway and their respective ladies. Really good company, and it did a lot of modern American and European plays with Jim Fitz as director. So Godfrey was working with The Globe. Cyril, I'm not sure. Cyril had his own company, and he used to do productions in the Gaiety ever so often. He did O'Casey and Shaw and things like that. And he and Maureen performed in the company. So that may have been what he was up to. But it was great to work with them. I was writing 2 plays at the time, and I finished them, and I was flogging them around Dublin, The O'Neill and The Death and Resurrection of Mr. Roach. And eventually, the Death and Resurrection of Mr. Roach was performed at the Theatre Festival in '68. And it was taken up by Jim Fitzgerald. Really, this is what happened to it. I couldn't get it on here. Mr. Blythe didn't like it one bit. And I was very close to T.P. McKenna. And T.P., he was a particular friend of Tom McIntyre's. And it was through Tom that I got to know T.P. And T.P. took an interest in both of us, in fact. But Tom was at that stage writing short stories, not plays. And he became very interested in Mr. Roach, and he took the Mr. Roach into the Abbey. So I don't know what actual process, reading process or whatever, took place, but I eventually heard, it was a time when the Abbey was changing quite a bit. It was moving into the new building and moving away from the Queen's, so there was that going on. The other very, very important thing that was happening at the time was Thomas McKenna had arrived into the theatre. And he hasn't been given nearly as enough credit, because he actually was a radical presence in the Abbey at this time. And he wrote to me a very kind letter saying that the managing director had turned down Mr. Roach. But what he said was the theatre is not ready for it as yet. Words to that effect, and that was very encouraging for me. It wasn't the first play I wrote. The first play I wrote was The O'Neill, and I sent that to the Abbey, and I actually got a very warm response from Ernest Blythe, who effectively said that it would be very difficult to do it in the resources until the new building was open and the new Peacock would come into existence. And he thought it would be an ideal play for the new Peacock. And that actually is what happened. It was eventually done after Mr. Roach. It was done in the Peacock. So the second play was done first, and then The O'Neill came after that.
Next, Thomas Kilroy discusses the strengths of the old Abbey Theatre company, and in particular leading actress Siobhan McKenna.
Well, I'd say there's a lot said about the pre-1950s Abbey. And, that the unkind things have been said about it, including unkind things said by myself about it. And it is true that the pre-1950s Abbey was in its kind of doldrums. But I think it had more to do with writing than anything else. The actors and people like Ria Mooney were quite extraordinary, and when they got the material, the Golden Brothers, Bill Foley, people like that, when they got the material, they lifted themselves, and you saw how good they were. Like the production of Long Day's Journey into Night, which everybody talks about. So I had an awful lot of respect for that generation of actors, and but I was mostly dealing with, I knew them of course, people like Jeff Golden, but I didn't really work with them. I worked with a younger group who were coming in at that point, and they were great. Irish acting is just wonderful and wonderful to work with. I don't think I've ever consciously written a part for a particular actor, except in the case of Double Cross and Stephen Ray. But that was a very particular reason for that, in the sense that Stephen became involved at a very early stage in the planning of the play itself. And so that would be an example. But when you're writing a play, you're constantly thinking of actors. So you have actors kind of in and out of your head, playing bits of stuff, and you're testing it against particular styles of acting. Acting is part of the writing process of a play, and if it isn't, it's not going to be a play, it'll be something else. And so that and while you're not actually consciously thinking of a particular part, there was one other case, and it's much later too, and that is the case of Ghosts, my version of Ghosts. Most of the versions of plays, indeed all of them that I've done, have been dictated by other people. It's a question of other people coming to me and saying, "Would you do this?" And in that instance, it was a case of Phyllis Ryan and Siobhan McKenna. And Siobhan wanted very much to work with me. She was a great admirer of tea and Sex and Shakespeare. She and Buggy used to read it as entertainment. She and Phyllis got this notion that the Ibsen could be adapted to Ireland with a priest and a woman as central to the thing. And so I said, I'd love to have a go at this, and off I went. And it must have taken me quite a while to write it, because what happened is Siobhan died. And so she never saw the actual play. But so Siobhan would have been an example of my trying to write for her. I saw some of the, I saw Her St. Joan with Hilton and Michael. Her St. Joan was mesmerising, absolutely mesmerising, because you have to think of something like Sive, to think of the quality that was there. It was a very pure performance, and people sometimes complained about her as not having total control over what she was doing, but that's rubbish. She was actually a very disciplined actor. And she had this quality of, for want of a better term, spirituality on the stage, and a kind of just a quality of stillness and wonderful, absolutely wonderful. But and she was a very powerful personality in her own way.
Kilroy recalls the Abbey premiere of Tea and Sex and Shakespeare, directed by Max Stafford Clark in 1976. and the opportunity to revise it for the revival produced by Rough Magic Theatre in 2012.
This was McKenna, and McKenna got Max involved. He felt it should have a non-Irish director, just to distance the whole thing a bit. And so I met Max. In fact, I was in the States and Max came out to visit me. McKenna flew him out, which was very good. And then Donal became involved, Donal McCann. So it was a really strong kind of team. The problem was the play. The play was needed at least another bath. I didn't get that. I managed to do that when I came to the Rough Magic revival of it. And there was confusion, you know, as to what exactly was going on. This crazy thing, you know, and I remember May Clusky, the wonderful May Clusky, turning to me at one point and saying, they're not going to have a clue what's happening. And she was right, but she was still very funny. I do. I think I'm slow in clarifying where I'm going in the writing of plays, and it takes me a while, and sometimes it doesn't quite gel. So that the revisiting of a play is very helpful for me, and I've done the same with Double Cross. And I think that certainly in that instance of Tea and Sex and Shakespeare, the kind of unifying of the play and giving it a unity and saying, surrendering to the madness in it and saying, that's it is mad, and go with it, I think is a help, and certainly was with that revival. I think it's an argument for, not for every writer. I mean, there are writers who have such a finished sense of their work that, like Brian, that this doesn't apply. But for writers who are kind of moving and changing and adapting and exploring and whatever, I think it's an argument for a workshop process. And certainly it would, I find that kind of process very helpful. It also led to the great relationship with Max, and I came back to work with Max several times again after that. And I just finished recently working with him in New York, and so that was a good part of it.
Kilroy describes working on Talbots Box, directed by Patrick Mason, and featuring comedian John Malloy as Matt Talbot in 1977 and 1978.
I think this brings up the whole question of Patrick Mason in my life,
yes.
And a hugely important presence, and somebody that I've worked with many times, and who I find a director particularly in tune with the writing process. I mean, there are different kinds of directors, but he's somebody who has a real understanding of writing and of the way in which writing, if you wish, has to be theatricalized, you know, and how it can be theatricalized. So that it was the first time I worked with him was on Talbots Box. And you have one question here about the individuals who are challenging to work with. Yes. Well, that was an example of serious challenge, not with Patrick, but with John Malloy. And John is a stand-up comic, and brilliant stand-up comic, very funny, who did the halls and performed as a stand-up comedian in Dublin for many years, and was less known as an actor. And like a lot of comics, he turned out to be a great actor, you know, and that Pat Short type of thing, you know, where you had this great comic skill, great timing, and a great sense of playing the audience. But Molloy had that in spades. But he was a very difficult man to work with, partly because I think of the lack of experience with the group, that he was used to being the figure alone on stage. So there was that element in it. But also partly the fact that he was just very awkward and difficult. And a curious thing happened with that play, in that John himself was a man of a total reprobate. He was had the jar and the women in legions of women, and here he was playing this saintly, ascetic Dublin class character who was a mystic. And as the play went on, as the production went on, Molloy became more and more identified with this. And it was just scary to watch. He became Matt Talbot. And it was the only time I've ever had this. Well, I've had something similar with Stephen and William Joyce. But this was uncanny, what happened. Now the play, this might help to understand what I'm talking about. When I started out writing this play, I wrote this play out of anger, and I wanted to write a send-up of this figure of Matt Talbot. And as the character became created, he wouldn't allow me to do this. And it was a tug of war where the character, as it were, insisted upon his integrity. And I found myself writing more and more empathetically with the character than I had started out with. And I think something similar happened with Molloy. Something similar where he found some kind of basis of connection, where he became the saintly figure. And by God, if you interrupted this process in performance or whatever, you heard about it. Not only that, but when it was on in the Peacock, around the corner you have the Pro Cathedral and you have the Matt Talbot Confraternity.
Yes, indeed.
And they started to come into the play. And I will never forget this. I stood at the back of the Peacock watching, and there were rows of women holding up rosary beads to John Molloy on the stage. It was uncanny, because you see, the thing is that Matt Talbot is triumphant in that play. He's not, he becomes something bigger than anybody else. And these people kind of tapped into that, But the rosary beads held up like this, and standing at the back of the Peacock, looking down into it. So that was an example of a challenge with him.
Thomas Kilroy spent much of his working life as a literary academic and lecturer. He discusses the value of a teaching career.
I taught a great deal of drama, and so something like early 17th century English plays, the later Shakespeare, Webster, people like that, Beaumont and Fletcher, gave me a grounding and a perspective, so that you're not just looking at the local scene through local eyes. You're drawing upon something else, the experience of this extraordinary theatre. And I think that that's the main value of it. And of course, you can get that without being an academic. You can just simply develop the interest and read the plays or look at the plays yourself. So that I think that the academic life came very much in a second place for me. It was a job, and for a variety of reasons I had to have a job. and there was no way, two ways about it. But simply, I think that teaching is, it's a good grounding for a writer, because you're communicating with an audience, and you're dealing with the imagination of other people, and all of that is connected somehow.
A regular theatre goer, Kilroy has been influenced by a number of different theatre forms and writers.
I've been very much influenced by non-Irish theatre, and I don't know what that is, whether it's, I don't think it's trying to be different or anything like that. It's just simply the way that my mind is and my taste is. I mean, there are writers that I admire enormously, like my contemporaries here, and very fortunate to be part of a group of writers who are as good as that. Brian and Tom and Tom McIntyre and people like that. So you have that, and you add going back into you have people like Dennis Johnson, who I find very interesting as well.
Yes.
But I wouldn't see any kind of direct, maybe I'm wrong, but I wouldn't see any kind of direct influence as such. I think I've been influenced by, to some extent anyway, by American theatre. But possibly very influenced by the Brechtian productions of Thomas McKenna. You know, the productions he did. He did St. John of the Stockyards with Siobhan McKenna.
Yes.
And his productions were very illuminating. Enrico Quattro, Henry IV, and I saw them at an impressionable time in my life as well, you know, so that I like that kind of scale. But I mean, I admire an enormous amount and variety of plays. I love early 17th century English drama, Jacobean drama. I love American plays, particularly Tennessee Williams. You know, so there's a huge amount of stuff that I kind of respond to positively, and Brecht, I like his work. So, and it's varied, you know, it's not in one territory. I think that unquestionably what has changed most dramatically in my lifetime is directing. That when I went into the theatre for the first time, there were a number of extraordinary directors around. And I'm not saying they weren't, you know, like Jim Fitzgerald, Hilton Edwards, Thomas McKenna himself, people like Barry Casson, really talented people. But there is now, I think, a greater sense of directing and a greater variety of directing and directing styles. And the importance of the director has become much more pronounced. And I think that that's a positive thing. I mean, the kind of things which had a big effect on me as a young person tended to happen outside Ireland. One of the most remarkable things that I ever saw in theatre was in Paris in the 60s. And it would have been before 1968 when the students hit the Odeon. In the Odeon Theatre, a production of Flaubert's St. Anthony. And I think this production had an effect on the writing of Talbots Box. And it starred Jean-Louis Barrault and Maurice Maurice Béjart. He was a choreographer, a Swiss choreographer, directed the play. And he had this big ramp down through the middle of the Odeon. I had never seen anything like it in my life. So that all the oriental fantasies of St. Anthony came marching down that ramp. Wonderful production. And Barrault was amazing. So it was things like that. And the production like John Osborne's The Entertainer with Olivia in the court, you know, that where you see this kind of acting, kind of something beyond the human almost, you know, kind of almost monstrous. These are things that stay with you and that become challenging in the writing of new work.
As a playwright who has had more than 20 productions at the Abbey, Kilroy explains the significance of working with the Abbey.
Well, it's huge actually, and the older I get, the more pronounced this becomes. You're talking about not just simply a theatre, but you're talking about a tradition, and a tradition going back to Yeats and Synge O'Casey. And this is huge. There's also, I think, what can only be called the Abbey style, and there have been different views of this over the years. But for me, it's something authentic. It's something which is grounded, and it is not imposed, you know, it comes from the ground up rather than from the mind down. And for that reason, you get a kind of security in the Abbey, you know, which is very important for writers and indeed actors as well. And it's, you know, it has to do with that solidity of that tradition that's there behind you, you know, all the time.
Thank you for listening to this podcast from the Abbey Theatre's Oral History Project. For more information about the archive, visit abbeytheatre.ie.